Hi, this is Jesse Dietschi, and you're watching ForBassPlayersOnly.com.
Hi, and welcome to ForBassPlayersOnly.com. I'm Jon Liebman, founder and first baseman. You know, a lot of people think they're too old or it's too late for them to learn how to play an instrument. So I created ForBassPlayersOnly.com for adults who want to learn to play bass, because I believe you're never too old and it's never too late to experience the joy and the pleasure of making music. ForBassPlayersOnly.com. Let's play bass. My guest this week is Jesse Dietschi from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And he plays double bass and electric bass. He's also a composer and educator, equally experienced in jazz, classical, and popular music. Jesse has performed, toured, and recorded all over North America with various orchestras, jazz ensembles, and rock groups, as well as folk and R&B artists. Currently, the principal bassist of Sinfonia Toronto, Jesse holds graduate degrees in jazz performance from the University of Toronto, orchestral performance from the Glenn Gould School, and composition from Brandon University. That's a very brief excerpt of Jesse's resume and accolades. He's done a whole lot of stuff in all kinds of musical situations. This is his first time on For Bass Players Only. Welcome, Jesse. It's good to have you here.
Well, thanks, John. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today.
My pleasure. Let's talk about some of that stuff that I just mentioned, but let's begin with the early days. How would you describe your initial exposure to music and how you became a bass player?
Sure. You know, I get this a lot because actually both my brother and I have an older brother named Ben who is a saxophone player. And so we both pursued music as careers. And people find that surprising because I did not grow up in a musical family per se. And I grew up in rural Manitoba, which is, I mean, when you say rural, I'm talking gravel road, 3 houses per mile kind of rural. So, it is a little bit odd that we got into this. But I think like a lot of musicians today, I got started through school music programs. My very first instrument was violin, which I studied privately when I was quite young. I did not really like it very much, if I'm being honest. And like many teenage boys, I eventually switched to guitar. And like many bass players who started on guitar, the first band I tried to join had another guitar player who was way better than me. But it was actually through jazz band that I kind of got started on electric bass, which was my first bass instrument. And mostly self-taught initially, kind of carrying over what I learned from, 6-string guitar. And it's one of those things, like every bass player, once people started learning that I was learning bass, suddenly all the opportunities started rolling in, right? I had lots of bands that were looking. And so very quickly I started to see how this became or could become part of my identity at a time in my life when, that's a pretty powerful, motivating factor. And I kind of never looked back. It just sort of, I got started playing. We were doing a lot of blues. We were doing a lot of, like kind of 70s rock, I guess you would say, which is a real strange choice for young kids in the 90s. But, learning Jethro Tull and, Jefferson Airplane before they were Jefferson Starship, that kind of stuff. I was a big Jimi Hendrix fan, Rolling Stones, all that kind of stuff. That's kind of how I learned to play bass. Eventually it shifted into really bass-driven bands like Tower of Power and, of course, eventually Jocko. And, that sort of one thing led to another. By the time I was in high school, I got the opportunity to start playing upright because, of course, in smaller towns, it's hard to find an upright bass, right? That usually is the limiting factor, access to an instrument. So, that's when things really started to take off. Again, I was studying jazz privately. I was gigging a lot around Winnipeg. And, I actually didn't get the chance to play in an orchestra until I was already in university. So as per your bit about the educational opportunities you offer, it's actually fairly appropriate because I didn't start orchestral playing until I was well into my, late teens or early 20s. And now I do a lot of all of those things, but orchestra seems to kind of dominate the work I have at the moment, and then a lot of freelance jazz work. and a lot of electric bass work in a wide variety of styles.
Well, you and I have quite a bit in common. I took the violin third grade and fourth grade, and
Classic.
I'm sure the rest of my family just loved hearing me practice.
Right. Yeah.
But and then I didn't start playing upright either until the end of my freshman year in college.
Right.
Studied with a man in the Detroit Symphony. So it's funny because I didn't know anything about you except what I had read in preparing for this interview. So I was going to ask if you were. I mean, you've done so much orchestral stuff, and you've done a lot of other stuff too. So you answered a lot of the questions. You started on electric. I was going to ask you. So were your influences like Gary Carr and Francois Rabal, or was it Jocko and Geddy Lee and Stanley Clark and so did you start discovering the classical guys, and then of course the jazz guys? I don't know, Ray Brown or Mingus or Niels Pedersen.
I started off as an electric bass student and just enthusiast. My earliest influences were like Victor Wooten, Marcus Miller, Stanley Clark a little later on, players like that. Obviously I got into Jocko and Rocco Prestia from Tower of Power. Those were the guys that kind of made me really, I'd start to identify as a bass player, and using their recordings to kind of learn what bass language sounded like. Once I started playing upright, when you go study through school, there's a little bit of like you do what you're told, right? So you listen to the old masters, and I of course became very familiar with Ray Brown. Being Canadian, of course, Oscar Peterson is required listening for all of us, but Night Train stands out as one of those. What's that?
Mississauga.
That's right.
Mississauga.
Yeah, Mississauga, just outside of Toronto. And then he lived in Montreal for a long time. And so, all Canadians are pretty well acquainted with Oscar. And of course, Ray Brown was his bass player for the vast majority of his career. And, listening to Ray's walking lines on albums like Night Train, that was kind of how I learned how to walk a bass line. That was my textbook, if you will. So that was very much listening to like learn how to play this music. And checking out Paul Chambers, because you kind of stumble upon Paul Chambers by accident, because you realize every album you're listening to has the same bass player on it, which is mind-blowing when you figure that out. So I started discovering all of those guys and very much entered bass as a jazz musician primarily. My first real upright bass, jazz bass player discovery that influenced my playing was Dave Holland. I remember in kind of the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, he was establishing his quintet with Chris Potter, and both me and my brother got really into that band. And that really kind of showed me like, this is what bass players play like today. This is kind of the new thing that's happening right now, which was so influential. And the classical guys, that came a bit later. Once I was already in university, my orchestral teacher was a member of the Winnipeg Symphony, and he actually studied with Francois Rabal. So he kind of got me into him through that. So I had to be kind of led into that community a bit. Now, of course, they're a huge influence on my playing. So not only Francois and Gary Carr, but Edgar Meyer is also a huge influence on me in terms of an improvising sort of classical bass player. His language is in between a bunch of styles of music, I would say, but certainly he can play the standard repertoire in a way that very few people can, and his improvising with the bow is unlike anything I've ever heard. So yeah, there's a lot of influences all rattling around in there, but those early influences of people like Dave Holland and Rocco Prestia, those certainly continue with me today. And I continue to be inspired by some of the really incredible classical soloists that are coming up now. Of course, we're seeing more and more people able to play the instrument to such an incredibly high level that I continue to be inspired by new influences.
Are you familiar with Terry Plumeri?
I know the name, but I don't know him well. Yeah.
He was a jazz player, a classical player, and his thing was doing these arco bebop solos and jazz tunes.
Right.
It was very, very tragic what happened to him. He was home and somebody broke into his house, and I think that person didn't expect anybody to be home, and he ended up getting murdered. That was in Florida. That
terrible.
Was, I don't know, within the past, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, something like that. Yeah, I think he was down in Florida. But Dave Holland is great. I've interviewed him and I've hung out with him. Edgar Meyer. When I was looking at schools, Indiana University was one of the ones I looked at, and he was a student there at the time.
Wow.
And you ever hear of Lucas Drew?
Yes, of course.
Yes. I studied with him down at the University of Miami. That's the school I chose.
Yes. But, we actually, with Sinfonia Toronto, we play a number of Lucas Drew arrangements because I think he and Nurhan Arman, who's the conductor of Sinfonia Toronto, had maybe worked together previously in an orchestra. I'm not certain on the connection, but they have a strong tie. And so many of his arrangements come our way. And I'm always very excited when I get to play them because I know they're going to have a really good bass part. I saw him at a convention for the International Society of Bassists. Right.
They have a convention every couple of years. So this one was in Colorado.
Okay.
And Lucas was there, and he remembered me. He had a stroke, and part of his face was drooping. It was sad to see that, but he remembered me, and it was really great to see him, and I learned a lot from him. Hey, you're in Toronto. Does the name Joel Quarrington mean anything to you?
Yes, of course. Joel is, again, one of our Canadian icons, and I've had the pleasure of working with him a number of times. For most of my time that I've lived in the city here, he's actually been in Ottawa as principal of the National Arts Centre Orchestra there, which is kind of one of the big three Canadian orchestras. We have Toronto, Montreal, and the National Arts Centre. I think he recently retired kind of a year or two ago, so he seems to float around. He's hard to pin down now, but I think he still does the Orford program in the summers. But I've worked with Joel a number of times. His influence is one that sort of just seeps into a lot of the number of colleagues of mine and audition winners for orchestras in Canada who are Joel students or people who have worked alongside him. It's he's got his influence spreads pretty much right across the entire country, and I'm sure well beyond that. So yeah, Joel is fantastic.
Did you ever notice anything unusual about his?
Yes, the tuning in fifths, German bow tuning in fifths. That's kind of his signature. I actually studied when I was at the University of Toronto doing a jazz degree, not a classical degree, but it was a master's in jazz performance. My teacher is a bass player named Andrew Downing, and Andrew also tunes in fifths and plays German bow. And it turns out I found out later that he studied with Joel for quite a while. So even the jazz players are being influenced by that, and you can always spot them a mile away because they're tuned in fifths, of course. But yeah,
Red Mitchell.
Yes, Red Mitchell, of course. So it works. Less common, but it works.
Well, you said something interesting, and you said it twice. Tuning in fifths. Yeah, that's bizarre. I get how that's weird. That's different. But why does German bow get your attention? Like it's
it's a funny thing. It's I think it used to be very polarizing which bow you used, and I imagine some of this is regional. I think in North America we are maybe a little more open to whatever, but of course in Europe they have very long-standing traditions. If you're playing in a German orchestra, you better play with a German bow. And if French orchestra would be the opposite. The other countries, I think, lie somewhere in the middle. Maybe it depends on their influence. But in Toronto, we mostly players here use French bow. But honestly, I think some of the changes we're seeing nowadays is people finally wrapping their heads around the fact that it kind of doesn't really matter. It matters for an individual, like you're going to learn one or the other, and it would be pretty difficult to switch. But honestly, it's about the sound, right? What does it sound like? It's not about the gear. It's not about the technique, but it was just one of these funny bass player cultural things that we seem to really like to fixate on which one people used. But there's of course many great German players, German bow players in town here, a lot of great French players. So clearly the type of bow doesn't matter, but yeah, it is a thing that people fixate on sometimes, isn't it?
It's funny because when I was, I hadn't decided to become a music major until the end of my freshman year at the University of Michigan. And at that time, music schools were very different. And
Hmm.
I thought you had to have I hate to use this word, legitimate instrument. I was going to study either classical guitar or classical bass because there
Hmm.
was no roll or there's no, you can't get a degree like that. So you have to declare, you have to choose an instrument. And I chose the double bass because for a lot of reasons. And there's so many more places where you can play bass. You can't really play guitar in an
Hmm.
orchestra unless you're a featured soloist. And bass, you
Right.
can play wet, you can play classical, you can play shows, you can do a lot of things more than
Hmm.
a guitar player can do. Well, long way leading up to I got a hold of this guy who was recommended, Maxim
Hmm.
Janowski, the Detroit Symphony, since he was like 19. And I
Wow.
was talking to him. He said, I was a beginner. I hadn't even started. He says, you play French bow or German bow? Huh?
Right.
What does that mean? And he said, well, I recommend you get a German bow. Okay. I didn't
Yep.
even know one from the other. But
Yep.
people that play French bow say it's easier. Something when I pick up a French bow, I hold it like a German bow. I try to anyway.
Yep.
People say you could dig in more with a German bow. So I don't know. I have a hunch you play French bow,
I play French,
or
I think what it boils
you
down to is you play what your teacher played, right? Which
yeah.
makes sense. That's
There
what
you
they're
go.
comfortable teaching you on, and when you're starting, you don't know one way from the other, so you just do what you're told. I think the questions, if people are still uncertain which if one's better than the other, I think the fact that there are great players on both and that there's so much variety tells you that it doesn't matter. You do
I
what makes sense for you, and there's pros and
yeah.
cons to both
Well,
for sure.
I did a gig one time. It was like a 2 week gig down in North Carolina, way back. And there was a flute player on the gig, and he saw me practicing. He saw the first
Hmm.
time I took out my bow. He says, "Oh, good for you. You have a German bow. That's great." He's a flute player. And he said, it was him or somebody that told me, I think it was, could it be the Philadelphia Orchestra or something? There was some orchestra that had it in their contract that all the bass players had to play German bow. That was
Hmm.
probably 40, 50 years ago. Does that sound like it could have been possible?
I mean, I don't know about the American orchestras, and if it was a thing, it certainly isn't today. But in Germany, I think it is very much a thing, and they actually many of them require you play a five-string bass also, which is I find interesting. I think in Europe, orchestras tend to own their own instruments, and then a player when they win a position, they give you the instrument to play. So that's a little bit more understanding that they would want you to play their instrument, and if it's a five string, then so be it. But yes, in Germany, they do seem to be fairly specific about what they're looking for. That being said, I've never worked in Germany, although I am a Swiss citizen, so I guess legally I could work in Germany. But yeah, I think now certainly people have relaxed in North America, at least. They've relaxed some of those preferences, and really what they're listening for is more specific musical things, like are your spiccato bow strokes nice and even, is your intonation really focused, are you getting a wide range of colors and sounds, like those are the things that actually matter, right? And whatever you need to do to make that sound happen, as long as it's you're not hurting yourself or people around you, it's all good.
Okay. I have a feeling I'm going to get frustrated with your answer to this question, but on a five-string bass, what is the fifth string? The additional string.
So they would add, it would be like a five string electric bass, so they usually add the low B string. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So it is,
I wasn't expecting. I thought you were going to say a C.
well, it's, yeah, I mean, I think they continue the intervals, right? But it is an alternative to the C extension on a standard four string bass, which again is more common, I think, in most of North American orchestras. So my bass, for example, has a C extension. That is if you've ever seen a double bass that has that extra piece of
Yeah.
ebony, it's like they extend the fingerboard up, so you got
Yeah.
the little capos, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Ron
which is a fun
Carpenter.
tool. and that can be fun on jazz gigs too, which is clearly it's not a required piece of equipment for jazz gigs, but getting to drop some of those low C's and low D's every now and then, depending on the tune you're playing, can be pretty fun. So that's one of the little tells when people see me show up to a jazz gig. They can kind of tell that I maybe also do some orchestra, because I'll have the C extension. I bring my stool. There's I'm kind of this funny mishmash in between the two cultural funny styles. Yeah.
I had the opposite experience. I'd show up for my jury at school to play, and I had my pickup on the bridge, and somebody
right.
said, what is
that? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I really thought you were going to say, having a low C extension, that doesn't bother me. It's almost like a hip shot on an electric bass. So you can go down a whole step, or you can go down a minor third, but to add another string, why not keep the intervals consistent? That just makes sense to me. So,
as far as I know, that's usually what they do. Every now and then, I think you'll see someone who goes the other direction and they add a high string. They add the high C string. Oh yeah. But for orchestral playing, they usually want the extra low notes, right? But as far as I know, they'd always keep the fourths.
Okay, I just thought of this. If somebody adds a high C and they're playing a concerto, do they play solo strings? So it's up a major second from there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. Maybe
have like a high D string.
I'm sure someone makes it out there somewhere.
Yeah. So what's keeping you busy these days, Jesse?
Well, I guess the big thing that I've had recently was releasing my debut album. So the album's called Gradient. We released it in early October, and then we did the kind of release concert a few weeks ago at the Jazz Bistro in Toronto, and that has been a long time in the making for me. I found, like almost every single musician out there, the pandemic was a challenging time, right? And I think for those of us bass players in particular who identify as performers so much, and our almost entire musical output is usually geared around public performance. Once they take the performances away, you're kind of left wondering, what am I doing? Who am I? Right. And what I found was that during that period, it made it really clear how little presence I had online in terms of music that people could access, and my kind of range of people only really knew me in Toronto, and outside of the city it was I just wasn't known because all my work was here. And that was a struggle for me, but I was able to use the time that I had to kind of set in motion the steps to make this album happen, which really was kind of a culmination of all the different types of work that I've been doing over the past 10 or 15 years. So it is a jazz trio album, piano trio. All the compositions are my own. And the title of the album is sort of a nod to the way that I was always taught about playing music, playing jazz specifically, in terms of things not ever being entirely one thing or another, but rather a blend of different influences, or different stylistic approaches. And in this case, it's a blend between modern jazz and for lack of a better term, classical music, Western European art, chamber music. For example, when I was in school learning about how to play swing, learning about what a swung eighth note is, right? That is it seems like a simple thing, but it's actually really difficult to explain. And the best explanation I ever heard.
Players are horrible at doing it. Right.
Exactly. I mean, anyone who doesn't listen to a lot of jazz is going to have a hard time understanding it, right? Because actually, it's not
all classical players.
No, of course. But it really does boil down to have you heard people do this, right? Because it is an auditory, it's an oral tradition rather than a written tradition. And the best explanation I ever heard for it was that it's sort of like the rhythm. It's not a fixed point between duple and triple. It's like a sliding scale in between. So, the faster the tempo of a swing tune, the straighter the swung eighth notes are going to be, right?
Yes.
But time period also factors. So if you listen to the way a Coleman Hawkins swung eighth note sounds versus a Chris Potter swung eighth note. Like, those are two very different things. Obviously Chris Potter's aware of Coleman Hawkins, but like, we're in a different place now. So like, chronologically, the timeline of the recordings is a factor. And then, stylistically, it depends on what musicians you're playing with, in terms of like, where are they from, and what music did they study, and all of these factors. So it's constantly changing, and it can even change within a tune, right? It's never a fixed point. And so gradient is sort of taking that idea and applying it to moving between two genres of music. So, any of the compositions on this tune, some of them are pretty much straight up modern jazz. Others are the way out more into the chamber music side of things. And then most of the tunes are somewhere in between, and they will adjust, they will slide in between those two kind of as the composition unfolds. And the players on the album, we have a fantastic young pianist named Ewan Farncombe, who's born and raised in Toronto here. And then their drummer is Ethan Ardelli, who also Toronto based, but originally from the Maritimes, from Cape Breton Island, and has toured the country many, many times over, and is a well-known Canadian jazz fixture. The two of them combined really brought a sense of kind of nuanced understanding to that concept of those tunes, and the way that they're able to adjust their playing based on the demands of the composition is really remarkable. So I'm really happy with how it turned out. I want to give a big thank you to the Canada Council for the Arts, who helped fund the project. That was part of the pandemic stages of finding money. Recording's expensive. And we're so fortunate in Canada to have a lot of government support for the arts. So the Canada Council helped get us the funds to make the album, and we have launched it now. And it's kind of the big highlight that I can talk about now, because it's December officially, is that if you go and you grab the December issue of Downbeat magazine and you take a look at the reviews into the debut section, they have a review written by Scott on Gradient. So we have a nice review, 3.5 stars in Downbeat magazine. Yeah.
Congratulations. That's great. And it's great to see you're getting a return for all those high taxes you pay in Canada as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's got to go somewhere.
Two questions about the record. How much arco and how much, if any, electric bass?
There's no electric bass. We decided that for the concept and the compositions, that it's keeping it acoustic made the most sense. But there is a considerable amount of arco. So there's a lot of balancing pits and arco. And actually, when I talk to bass players about this, I feel like they can appreciate some of the, we'll say, technical or logistical challenges that posed in the studio. Because of course, anyone who's recorded a jazz record on double bass knows that you need to isolate the bass. That is one of the big hurdles, technically speaking. And we recorded at a studio in Toronto called Canterbury Music Company, which is a fantastic studio that really seems to specialize in acoustic jazz recordings. So they have a beautiful bass booth, isolation booth built, and they know exactly how to mic it to get the sweetest sound. And I love recording there. It always sounds great, but it is very much geared towards pizzicato bass, right? Because that's what the style calls for. So once I pulled out the bow, it presented some new challenges, because of course, when you're miking an orchestral string instrument, you want to get that mic further away, and you probably use different combinations. You want a big space. All of those are completely opposite to what you want for a jazz record. So we had to kind of thread the needle in between the two in terms of our setup. And I actually had to go back for a separate session after the whole band was done, and redo some of the arco bits in the main room with the mics far apart, because the sound just wasn't working. But I couldn't go out there while the pianist was there, or we'd have bleeding and all that kind of headache stuff you got to deal with when you're making a record, right? So yeah, I mean, that was really fun. It was a lot of work to kind of work that in, but that was sort of my thing, is like, I want there to be a really strong arco presence on this record. I want to show people who aren't bass players what a bass can sound like. So the pit stuff is what you would hear on a jazz bass record. Some melodic playing, a lot of soloing, upper register, all that stuff. arco wise, there's actually quite a range too. So there's a lot of melodic content, kind of mid to upper range, almost soloist type playing. There's some arco accompaniment behind piano and drums. And then there's also some like kind of strokey, like orchestral, low register rhythmic playing that I think maybe people who haven't heard a lot of orchestral bass might not know what that sounds like. So there's a pretty good gamut. It really kind of runs the spectrum of what an acoustic bass can sound like.
That's awesome. And it's called Gradient.
Gradient. Yeah, it's available. People can check it out on all the streaming services, Apple Music and Spotify and etc. And then I'm also selling copies through Bandcamp. So it's just jessedietschi.bandcamp.com. If you go on Bandcamp and you search my name, you'll find it. So yeah, it's out there for people to check out if they're interested.
Is it just Jesse Dietschi, or is it the Jesse Dietschi Trio? Or
it's on streaming. It's under Jesse Dietschi Trio. That's the artist name. Bandcamp. I think you could search either of them and you'll find me. I think technically it's under my name. That was a kind of another one of these little quirky things that you don't really think about until you're releasing an album. Is the artist name matters? Is it your name? Is it your name trio? Is it all these funny so in setting up all of my streaming platforms, I ran into problems because I couldn't find my music, and it's because I was looking under my name instead of the trio's name. So, just one of the many little silly technical glitches you got to work through, right?
Now you know who you are, though, right?
Now I know who I am. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's funny. You reminded me. You ever come across the name Ben Allison? He's in New York.
Yeah, again, one of these names that I see a lot. Ben Allison, Ben Street, another bass player, I think does a lot of crossover stuff too. So I don't know him personally, but certainly know him by reputation.
Because I interviewed him a couple of times, and the last time he made me chuckle because I was surprised. I asked him about his arco playing. He says, "No, I don't really play with the bow," and he says it's dumb because you're playing a jazz gig, and if it's a ballad, the last note is with the bow. So I just wasn't interested in it. And why should he put in all that work if he's just going to play one long note after? I don't know. It just kind of gave me a chuckle.
Well, there's a Toronto bass player named Jim Vivian who had a great line where he called the bow the world's most expensive tuner because I think for a lot of, he has a very valid point. Both of them have a valid point, which is for a lot of jazz bass players, that's what the bow was. It was the thing you use at the start to tune, and you use it, for the held note at the end of the ballad. So the why question comes up a lot, and people do talk to me about this. Like, what is the benefit? That's an obvious benefit if you want to work in orchestras, but if that's not something that you're interested in, why would you put that time in? And I guess my answer to that would be, this kind of came up for me personally as well when I was kind of going back into school. When I went to orchestra school, the Glenn Gould School, I had already been a working professional for a number of years. So I was making the decision to sort of step back from working and go back to school again, which is a big decision to make. And, in the depths of those couple of years, and I'm practicing away, I started to wonder, like, am I losing ground as a jazz player while I'm here? Is this worth the time? Am I making a mistake? But what I found after I came through that was that even during those 2 years where I was practicing more than I'd ever practiced before, but very little of it was jazz oriented. I wasn't learning tunes or transcribing or, playing with drummers or all the things that you usually do. But I was practicing the bass to a degree of detail that I had never practiced before. And what started to happen was that the bow almost served as like a flashlight to direct my attention to holes in my playing that I did not even know were there before. And once I had taken the time and had the patience and the setting where I could take the time to work through those things and fix them, what happened it's like, tearing your house apart to fix the foundation and then rebuilding it afterwards. And you kind of don't realize what a difference it makes until it's finished. And what I found was that my fluency on the instrument had never been better. And I was only able to gain that through that sort of painstaking kind of stripping it back to the studs and building up again. And the bow just made so many things more obvious to me. but it's tough. If a jazz player right now just said, okay, I'm going to grab the bow and work on my intonation, the likelihood that there would be bow issues that hinder their ability to hear the intonation is almost guaranteed. So it's like you got to work through those things first before you can see the other problems. And then you got to continue working on those other problems. And yeah, it's a ton of work. And there's obviously a degree to which the work that I did becomes more like that's specifically to work in an orchestra. Like, I don't know how valuable it would be for a jazz player to be practicing excerpts, like audition lists, and working on their bounce spiccato bow strokes. Like, if they're interested, then absolutely they should do it. But that's where it starts to become slightly more tangential and less relevant. But before that point, there's a ton of work to do. And I really do feel like it is mutually beneficial. Whatever style of music you play, like, what are bass players there for? We're there for, rhythmic clarity, harmonic clarity, and sonic clarity, right? Like, you got to fill in that low register of the sound, the sonic landscape of the band. You got to have good time and play in a way that rhythmically is appropriate for the style of music, and you got to make the harmony clear, right? You got to be able to outline the changes or whatever. And if you're a jazz player and you're so fixated on walking bass lines, but your intonation is so bad that people can't tell what the harmony is, that's a problem, right? And we're so fixated on time and quarter note feel, which is great. And like, you got to be able to play in tune. It's kind of non-negotiable, right? There is some subjectivity to it to pass a certain degree, but I think of intonation as almost like a target, like darts, that there's always some leeway, but it depends on where your expectations are. So like a novice darts player is going to be happy to just put the thing on the board, right? But if you're a professional, you're expecting, pretty close to a bullseye, 90% of the time. So, how accurate do you need to be? It depends on your expectations. And I think players at a high level, no matter what style of music they're playing, the expectations, the margin for error gets narrower and narrower. And that level of detail takes some doing. And I think the bow just makes it easier to hear, more obvious, and allows you the opportunity to fix it. Then that's kind of my little soapbox rant.
I love how seriously you take what you do. That's great. Let's continue this in a different vein. Let's talk about learning bass for people who are not career bound. Right. And for bass players only, this is a bass instruction site. And I've got people from all over the world, pretty much all 50 states and 50, 60 some countries worldwide. I don't know, last time anybody counted, coming to ForBassPlayersOnly.com every day to learn how to play bass.
Right.
Some of them might want upright and a couple might want the bow, but that's not what most of them want. They want to play some classic rock riffs with their buddies. Totally. Or some blues shuffles or some walking bass maybe. But most of the people I'm attracting are men in their 50s, 60s, 70s. I've got some that are even older than that. I've got students in their 80s who are coming to play bass. Obviously, they're not looking to get a touring gig and playing sold-out arenas to screaming fans. They just want to do what I said. And a lot of times when you get to be that age, things like arthritis, tendonitis, and recovering from surgery, maybe things like that. I'm just telling you all this to give you a context.
Right.
Those are a lot of the people that we do get some women too, but mostly men. So within that context, what about somebody like that who wants to learn bass? What kind of advice could you impart to somebody in that category that just wants to do that? What should they know? What should they be thinking about?
That's such a great question. And even though I am not at that stage of my life yet, I feel like I relate to some of those ideas just because I did get into, by professional standards, got into a lot of what I do at a later age as well. But being a bass player is it's just such a rewarding experience, and when I think about what the electric bass means to me, as someone who works predominantly as an upright bass player, it's just fun to play. Like I just really, I cherish opportunities that I get to play electric bass because it's rewarding to me, because I feel like I can just kind of gear down a little bit, I'm a little, upright bass is just a really intense, it's a very rewarding path for me. But when I occasionally get to do things like play electric bass with symphonies, like the Toronto Symphony, when they do pops works and stuff like that. Like I got to do, actually my first gig with them was an ABBA tribute. They brought in a Finnish a cappella group that did a tribute to ABBA, and that was just such a rewarding gig for me, because I mean disco bass is like, yeah, I mean that's kind of in disco and R&B is, that's like my bread and butter on that instrument. It's how I learned to play, and all those ABBA tunes, any of us who played weddings and stuff, we played them all over the place, and it's just fun. Be on stage at a concert hall in a suit playing ABBA, like that's amazing. And that's all anyone talked to me about from the symphony afterwards. Not Beethoven 9 that I had been practicing for like 2 months, but no, the ABBA gig. That's the thing that stood out, So I certainly understand the need or the desire to just want to have that connection, because when you play that instrument, you get to build that community, even if it's amongst people for whom this is not their career. Getting to that chance to connect with them, playing music with people is a lot of fun. And as a bass player, the number one thing I would remind people of is that it's not about being the most technically gifted musician. It's about understanding your role in the ensemble and taking pride in filling that role to the absolute best ability that you can. And if people learn to associate that, yeah, we call this person, they come in and they just kind of lay it down, they show up on time, they're fun to be around, they enjoy doing this. They're not constantly trying to reinvent the wheel or draw attention to themselves. They're just there to serve the music and just play and just make the band sound good and have a good time doing it. There's obviously technical things you got to work out, and that's part of the journey, is learning about music. But so much of it is like, if you know the music, if you love the music and have listened to it a ton, that's kind of half the battle, I think, especially when you're playing rock. It's like, it doesn't matter if you can do all sorts of elaborate things on the instrument. It matters, do you fill those 3 roles that I mentioned before, right? Do you kind of fill the sonic space of the bass, right? Fill in that bottom end. Do you have good time, reliable time, right? Where you just kind of keep chugging away, even if maybe other people are having a bit of trouble, you can just be a reliable source for them. And can you outline the chords really clearly, which ultimately means, like, do you know the tunes, right? Some hot shot coming in who doesn't know the tunes is actually going to be more of a liability than a help, right? So, I think to me, the most valuable skill to do for someone in that position is play along with recordings. If you can make it sound and feel good when you're playing with the people who did the tune originally, then you're going to be good when you get together with your friends, with your colleagues, and jam a bit. But yeah, I would just really focus on the why and not only fixate on the how. Like, why are you there? Why is a bass player so important? And make sure that you're prioritizing those things, the needs of the band, I guess, over anything else, and people will appreciate you for it.
Beautiful. That's great. I love everything you said. Just one caveat I have, though. When you're playing along with a record and it feels good, it's easy to think that you're the one making it feel good until you turn
that is true.
The record.
That is true. It's not perfect, but it's also just way more fun to practice that way too, right? Because again, if you're not in it as a career, then you want to enjoy practicing too. Like, if practicing is a chore, then you're not going to want to do it. So I think anything that makes practicing enjoyable is great. Yes. And but yeah, that is yeah, how much of it's you and how much of it is the other people. That's very true.
But I'm with you 100%. What about the future, Jesse? What else? Either something you've always wanted to do and haven't gotten around to yet, or that you currently have in the works? What's going on and what's percolating up there?
What's percolating? That is a really good question, because we're kind of entering this concert season feels like a kind of a new chapter, if you will. Like we can't coming out of the COVID lockdowns, the first kind of, the end of the 21-22 season and then the 22-23 season, there was this almost frenetic energy of all of these organizations and venues and everything ramping back up. And especially 22-23, it was the first time people felt confident that they could book things and they would actually happen, right? And so things just escalated so fast that it was this whirlwind. I mean, I played something like 30 weeks with the Toronto Symphony, which is almost full time. I was working with the Canadian Opera Company at the same time. There were also 4 major auditions in this area that I took, in addition to some of the jazz gigs and then preparing for this recording. So that was a really bonkers year. And now the dust is settling a bit. The people who won the positions are in their new roles, and all the organizations are kind of readjusting and shifting. So the work situation is changing for this year. I hope to continue subbing with all these organizations. This role that I seem to am starting to fill, where I can come in and be not only an extra section bass player, but also play, jazz bass in the rhythm section and double on electric bass as well, seems to be serving me well. There's not a ton of opportunities to do that, but they do come up, and it's a lot of fun. But I guess the big thing for me is kind of looking at what happens next with this recording. And I guess the next big thing for us would be touring. So we're starting to look at potentially doing some dates. We'll probably start sticking across Canada, and then eventually looking at booking some US dates as well, and kind of looking down the road, which is, again, new for me. I've been on many tours across Canada, across the United States, across Europe. I even did some gigs in the Middle East a few years ago, but I never been the one booking any of it. Right? It's a whole nother thing when you're the one who has to do all the follow-ups and the emails. So, it's a little humbling to feel like such a rookie. Even though I've done this so many times. But that's kind of my big thing, is like, let's take this music and let's get as many people to hear it as we can, and look at performance opportunities outside of Toronto, and continue promoting the music in new ways to bring it to as many people as possible.
Beautiful. Do it. And the new record is called Gradient. I haven't heard it yet, but I like it already, just from everything I've heard about it. And congratulations on everything you've done. And this is just incredibly uplifting and inspiring listening to you. And this is some pretty, I was going to say niche, but you're from Canada. My Canadian wife would say niche. This is some stuff we're talking about, but I must be a total bass nerd and a bass geek, because this stuff really excites me listening to you talk about it. So
that's great, man. I mean, we need our place to nerd out about bass stuff too, right? So
that's right. Well, thanks so much, Jesse, and much luck, continued success to you. And let me know how it's going, and we'll share any good news with my audience here at For Bass Players Only.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, John. Really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Jesse. You're watching ForBassPlayersOnly.com. I'm Jon Liebman, founder and first baseman. A lot of people think they're too old or it's too late for them to learn how to play an instrument. So I created ForBassPlayersOnly.com for adults who want to learn to play bass, because I believe you're never too old and it's never too late to experience the joy and the pleasure of making music. For BassPlayersOnly.com, this is the place to learn bass. Thanks again to my special guest, Jesse Dietschi. I bet nobody's ever mispronounced your name before.
Oh, not a single time.
Jesse Dietschi. I will see you all right here, same time, same place next week. In the meantime, let's play bass.